The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There are artists who chase the spotlight their entire lives. And then there is Benny Andersson, the man who helped create one of the most beloved musical acts in history, yet spent most of his career standing in the shadows of the very thing he built. At 78 years old, Benny is finally ready to speak. Not through melodies or chord progressions, not through the careful language of a press release, but through the kind of raw, unfiltered honesty that only comes with age and distance. What he has to say will change the way you hear every ABBA song you have ever loved. For decades, the world believed it understood ABBA. For impossibly glamorous Swedes, two couples deeply in love, making music so joyful it could light up any room. The costumes were extravagant. The hits were relentless. The smiles, wide and bright, seemed to say, "We have everything." But Benny Andersson is here now to tell you that what you saw on the surface was never the full picture. Beneath the sequins and the disco lights was something far more complicated, far more fragile, and in many ways, far more beautiful than any of us were allowed to see. This is not a story about scandal. It is not about betrayal or collapse in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter, and in truth, more devastating than that. It is the story of four gifted, deeply human people who found each other at exactly the right moment, poured every broken piece of themselves into their music, and created something that outlived them all. It is a story about pain mistaken for joy, about silence used as armor, and about the hidden cost of making art that speaks for the entire world, while barely managing to speak to the people in the room with you. Benny Andersson has lived with this story for half a century. He has carried it in interviews where he gave just enough to satisfy, in compositions that said everything his voice could not, and in the long, quiet years after ABBA ended, when he worked through his grief the only way he ever knew how, by making more music. But now, at this stage of his life, something has shifted. The need to protect the image is gone. The fear of being misunderstood no longer holds the same weight it once did. What remains is the truth, and Benny finally is ready to share it. Long before ABBA existed, there was a boy in Stockholm who heard the world differently from everyone around him. Benny Andersson grew up in a household where music was not entertainment, it was language. His father played the accordion. His grandfather sang folk songs that had been passed down through generations. Before Benny could articulate a feeling, he could find it in a melody. Before he could explain what he wanted to say, he could play it on the piano and feel it land somewhere deep and true. This is a detail that matters more than it might seem. Most musicians discover their instrument. Benny seems to have been discovered by music itself. He did not learn to play in order to perform. He learned to play in order to survive, not in any dramatic sense, but in the quiet, internal way that introverted people find their footing in a world that moves too fast and expects too much. Music gave young Benny a place to stand when everything else felt uncertain. He was a teenager when he joined his first professional group, the Hep Stars, one of Sweden's most popular bands in the mid-1960s. By the time he was 20, he was already a recognized name in Scandinavian pop music. But even then, surrounded by screaming crowds and the early intoxication of fame, Benny kept a part of himself deliberately separate. He observed more than he performed. He listened more than he spoke. While other musicians were drawn to the adoration of audiences, what Benny wanted was something that audiences could not give him, the feeling that what he had made was truly good, that it had said something real. This quiet perfectionism, this relentless internal measuring of his own work against some ideal that only he could fully hear, would become both the engine of ABBA's greatness and one of the most significant sources of his private suffering. It is a contradiction that would define the next 2 decades of his life. He was building something for the world while remaining fundamentally unable to be fully present in the world he was building. He has spoken recently, with a kind of clarity that only retrospect allows, about those early years. He says that even as a young man, he understood that he was more comfortable inside a song than inside a conversation, that the piano was a mediator between his inner life and everything outside, that what he could not say directly, He could shape into harmony and release into the air, trusting that someone, somewhere, would feel it and understand. This was not an unusual gift, but the degree to which Benny relied on it, and the degree to which it would eventually isolate him from the people he loved most, was something he would only come to understand much later. When Benny Andersson and Bjorn Ulvaeus began writing songs together, something happened that is difficult to explain in purely technical terms. Yes, they were both talented. Yes, they understood pop structure, melody, and the mechanics of a great hook. But what happened between them in those early years of collaboration went beyond technique. They found a frequency together, a way of working where Benny's emotional architecture and Bjorn's narrative precision produced something neither could have achieved alone. Benny has said in recent years that he always thought of himself as a builder rather than a composer in the traditional sense. Where others heard a song as a sequence of notes, he heard it as a structure. Rooms and corridors, light and shadow, tension and release. He would spend entire sessions adjusting a single chord change, not because anything was technically wrong, but because the feeling wasn't honest yet. Because the music was telling a version of the truth rather than the full truth. And for Benny, the full truth was the only acceptable destination. This obsession produced some of the most emotionally complex pop music ever written. The genius of ABBA's greatest songs is not that they are happy or sad. It is that they are both at once, and often in ways that listeners cannot fully explain. You hear The Winner Takes It All, and you feel joy and grief simultaneously. You dance to Dancing Queen, and there is something beneath the celebration, a longing, a tenderness, an awareness of how fleeting the perfect moment truly is. That shadow inside the sunshine was not an accident. It was Benny doing what he had always done, building rooms inside the music for the feelings that had nowhere else to go. What the world did not see during ABBA's peak years was how much of himself Benny poured into that process, and how little of what he poured in was ever recognized as his. The public knew Agnetha and Frida. They knew the voices, the faces, the drama of 2 marriages and 2 breakups playing out simultaneously on the world's biggest stages. Benny and Bjorn were the songwriters, a label that managed to be both accurate and deeply inadequate. They were the architects of everything the world loved, and they were largely invisible for it. Benny has reflected on this with a kind of careful honesty in recent interviews. He does not claim to have been exploited. He does not speak with bitterness about the women who stood in the spotlight while he sat behind the glass in the control room. What he describes is something quieter and more personal than resentment, a slow accumulation of invisibility that gradually became its own kind of wound. He was not angry. He was unseen. And for a man who had always used his art as his primary way of being known, of saying, "This is who I am, this is what I carry," being unseen inside the very thing he had built was its own particular form of loneliness. Benny Andersson and Annie Frid-Lyngstad, Frida, found each other the way artists often find each other, gradually, then all at once, in the space between making something and understanding what it meant. Their connection grew out of long studio sessions, shared creative exhaustion, and the specific kind of intimacy that forms between people who are building something together. They fell in love inside the music before they fully fell in love outside it. In theory, this should have been a foundation strong enough to hold anything. In practice, it contained a problem that neither of them could see clearly while they were living inside it. Frida loved with her whole body and voice. She was emotionally present in ways that were almost physically visible. When she sang about pain, she had already felt it. When she stood on stage and delivered a lyric about heartbreak or longing, there was nothing performative about it. She was not playing a character. She was offering herself completely, and she needed that same completeness in return. She needed the person she loved to show up fully, not just in the music, but in the morning. Not just in the studio, but in the silences between sessions. Benny loved differently. He loved through what he made. When the emotion became too large, too complex, too risky to hold in a room full of people, he carried it to the piano and let it out there. He did not process his feelings by talking about them. He processed them by transforming them into art, into chord progressions, into arrangements, into the specific quality of sadness that lives inside ABBA's most beautiful songs. For Benny, making the music was the intimacy. The song was the conversation. The melody was the declaration. The tragedy is that this was genuine. He was not being evasive in the calculated way of someone who does not care. He was being the only version of himself he knew how to be. But Frida needed more than a melody. She needed presence. And what Benny gave her instead, however beautiful, however true, was art. Art that moved millions of people who would never know it was addressed to her. Art that said everything she needed to hear, but said it to the world instead of to her face. Benny has spoken about this with a kind of quiet grief in his later years. He understands now what he could not understand then, that being loved by someone who expresses their love almost entirely through creative work can feel, from the inside, like not being loved at all. That the most exquisite song is no substitute for the specific, unglamorous presence that real intimacy requires. He gave her his best lines. He just gave them to the music first. Fame arrived for ABBA with the speed and force of a wave that no one had seen building. After their 1974 Eurovision victory with Waterloo, the world tilted in their direction and did not tilt back for nearly a decade. They toured. They recorded. They appeared on magazine covers in 17 countries simultaneously. They were, by any measurable standard, among the most successful musical acts the planet had ever produced. For Benny, this period was something more complicated than triumph. The machinery of celebrity, he would later reflect, has very specific requirements. It needs faces. It needs stories. It needs personalities that can be compressed into headlines and photographs and 30-second television appearances. And among the 4 members of ABBA, Benny did not fit the machinery's requirements. He was quiet where the machinery wanted noise. He was internal where it wanted spectacle. He was interested in the work where it was interested in the person. This meant that even at the absolute peak of ABBA's global dominance, Benny experienced the strange, disorienting sensation of being both essential and invisible. The music that he had built, the harmonic architecture that gave every ABBA song its particular emotional weight, the arrangements that turned catchy melodies into genuinely moving experiences, was everywhere. His work was on every radio station, in every discotheque, in every teenager's bedroom from Stockholm to Sydney. But Benny himself was almost nowhere. Reviews praised the singers. Profiles celebrated the drama of the 2 couples. Award ceremonies handed trophies to the group as an entity, which was fair enough. But in the cultural narrative that surrounded ABBA, Benny existed mostly as a footnote. He was never a man who needed fame in the traditional sense. He says this clearly and without self-pity, and it rings true. What he needed was something more specific, something that fame, when it comes, rarely delivers anyway. He needed to be understood. He needed people to hear the music he had made and recognize it as the complex, emotionally layered, carefully constructed thing that it actually was. Instead, much of the world heard it as pop product, catchy, disposable, pleasant. The depth he had poured into it was invisible, or worse, was dismissed as irrelevant. This gap between what he had made and how it was received became, over time, its own quiet wound. Not loud enough to be called suffering. Not dramatic enough to be called crisis. Just the persistent low-level ache of a person who has said something enormously important and has not been truly heard. ABBA's end was not an event. It was a weather pattern, a long, slow change in atmospheric pressure that everyone inside it could feel, but that no one named out loud until it had already passed. There was no dramatic confrontation, no defining moment of collapse, no single morning when the 4 of them sat down and agreed that it was over. There was instead a gradual withdrawal of the thing that had held them together. The creative joy, the sense that what they were making still surprised them, still felt necessary. It faded, and then it was gone. And then they each moved on in the private way of people who have shared too much to process it in public. For Benny, the years that followed ABBA's quiet dissolution were years of exile and reconstruction. He threw himself into theater work, into Chess, the musical he wrote with Bjorn and Tim Rice, and later into the ambitious, deeply personal Christina Fran de Vemela, a project that gave him the scale and the emotional complexity he had always needed. These were not nostalgia projects. They were genuine artistic leaps, works of real ambition, evidence that the creative engine that had driven ABBA had not simply switched off when the band stopped recording. But there's also, beneath the industry of his post-ABBA years, a kind of processing happening, slow, private, and necessary. Benny has admitted that it took him far longer than he expected to come to terms with what ABBA had been and what it had cost. The band had demanded so much of him for so long, creative, emotional, psychological, that when it ended, he did not know at first how to exist without its structure. He had organized his entire inner life around the work of being in ABBA, and in its absence, he had to find himself again from a different angle. He kept a journal in the years after. He wrote letters that he never sent, to Frida, to Bjorn, to Agnetha. Letters that said the things the songs had been saying for years, but that he had never managed to say face to face. He was not writing to reopen wounds. He was writing to understand them, to trace the shape of his own experience with enough distance to see it clearly. What he found, through that process, was not the simplified story the world had always told about ABBA, not the fairy tale of four talented people who made beautiful music together until real life interrupted their happiness. What he found was something more honest and ultimately more meaningful. The story of four deeply imperfect people who found in each other and in their work a temporary home. A shelter built from sound. It did not last forever, but while it stood, it was extraordinary. There is a question that sits at the heart of any serious engagement with ABBA's catalog, and it is a question that Benny Andersson has spent most of his adult life refusing to answer directly. The question is this: where did it come from? Not the technical skill, not the knowledge of harmony and arrangement and production. Those things can be traced, explained, taught. The question is about something else, the particular emotional quality that lives inside even ABBA's most straightforwardly joyful songs, the shadow that falls across the middle eight of Dancing Queen, the specific ache that pulses through the verses of Fernando, the devastating clarity of The Winner Takes It All. Where did that come from? What was it made of? Benny is answering now, in a way he was never willing to answer before. It was made of everything he could not say. It was made of the distance between him and the people he loved. It was made of the loneliness of being fundamentally misunderstood even at the peak of his public success. It was made of the specific pain of a person who has learned, very early, to express his most important feelings only through art, and who therefore carries those feelings at a distance from his own life, touching them only when he sits down to work. Every sad ABBA song contains this. Every minor chord, every unexpected harmonic turn, every moment when the melody seems to be reaching for something it cannot quite grasp. These are not decorative elements. They are biographical. They are Benny, saying in music what he could not say in a room. They are the most honest communication he was capable of, and they are addressed, in some fundamental sense, to everyone and no one simultaneously, to the world in general, rather than to the specific people who needed to hear them most. This realization does not diminish the music. If anything, it deepens it. The knowledge that Knowing Me, Knowing You was written during a period of genuine private grief makes it more, not less, powerful. The understanding that the emotional precision of ABBA's ballads came from a real place, from a man who was living through exactly what he was